The morning sun was just peeking through the Seattle skyline as a young black professional adjusted his navy blue tie in the lobby mirror of the gleaming Tech Innovations Incorporated building. This wasn't just another day at work, it was his first day at what he hoped would be his dream job. With 10 years of coding experience under his belt and countless successful projects in his portfolio, he felt ready to take on this new challenge. As he walked through the glass doors of the modern office space, the excitement in his stomach mixed with the usual first-day jitters. The office was everything he'd imagined during his interviews. Open-plan workspaces filled with developers typing away at standing desks, meeting rooms with walls you could write on, and the smell of premium coffee wafting from the break room. "Welcome to the team," called out the HR representative who had handled his hiring process. She guided him through the office, pointing out different departments and introducing him to his new colleagues. Everyone seemed friendly enough, offering warm smiles and quick hellos. But when they reached the software development department, something shifted in the atmosphere. That's when he met his new boss, the department head. Right from the first handshake, something felt off. While the boss's smile reached his lips, it never quite made it to his eyes. His grip was loose, almost dismissive, and he barely looked at his new employee while going through the standard welcome speech. "So, you've worked on security protocols before?" the boss asked, his tone carrying an edge of doubt that didn't match the impressive resume they discussed during the interviews. "Well, we do things a bit differently here. You'll need to prove yourself before taking on any major projects." The new hire nodded professionally, even as he felt his heart sink a little. He'd faced skepticism before, it came with the territory, but something about his boss's demeanor suggested this might be more than the usual new employee scrutiny. Over the next few weeks, his suspicions grew. While other new hires were given challenging projects and opportunities to shine, he found himself assigned to basic debugging tasks, work that was far below his skill level. During team meetings, the boss would often interrupt his contributions or dismiss his suggestions without consideration, only to praise similar ideas when they came from other team members. The situation became more apparent during lunch breaks. His boss would chat easily with other employees about their weekends, their families, their aspirations. But whenever he tried to join these conversations, the boss would suddenly remember an urgent email or an important call. One particular afternoon stood out. He had stayed late to finish a complex piece of code that could significantly improve their current project's efficiency. As he was about to submit it, his boss walked past his desk, glancing at his screen. "Interesting approach," the boss said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But let's have someone else review it first. We can't risk any mistakes." The emphasis on that last word hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Despite the mounting frustration, he remained professional and continued to produce excellent work. He documented everything meticulously, every interaction, every dismissed idea, every undermined contribution. He knew his worth, and he wasn't going to let anyone's prejudice define his career. What he didn't know was that these early days were just the beginning of a story that would transform not just his career, but the entire company culture. Sometimes the hardest starts lead to the most meaningful changes, and the most difficult people in our lives can become unexpected allies when the full picture finally comes into view. Each morning, as he waited for the elevator, he reminded himself why he chose this field in the first place: his passion for technology, his drive to innovate, and his desire to pave the way for others who might face similar challenges. Little did he know that his boss was carrying a secret that would soon turn their professional relationship upside down, and that these challenging first weeks were setting the stage for an extraordinary revelation. The tension was building, but so was his determination. He had faced obstacles before and overcome them. This situation would be no different, though its resolution would prove far more surprising than anyone could have anticipated. As he settled into his role, he couldn't have imagined that the very person who seemed determined to diminish his contributions would soon become central to one of the most unexpected stories of personal and professional transformation in the company's history. 6 months into his new role at Tech Innovations Incorporated, the signs of unfair treatment had become impossible to ignore. Each day brought fresh examples of how differently his boss treated him compared to his colleagues, and the weight of it was becoming harder to bear. The morning stand-up meetings were particularly telling. While other team members received enthusiastic responses to their updates, his contributions were met with skeptical looks and unnecessary questioning. "Are you sure that's the best approach?" his boss would ask, even when he presented solutions that aligned perfectly with industry best practices. One rainy Tuesday morning, he watched as a junior developer received lavish praise for implementing a simple feature, the exact same feature he had suggested 3 weeks earlier, only to have it dismissed as not fitting our architecture. The junior developer even used the same coding approach he had outlined in his original proposal. As his colleagues congratulated the junior developer, his boss shot him a challenging look, as if daring him to speak up. The pattern continued in project assignments. While his peers were handed exciting challenges that could advance their careers, he found himself stuck with maintenance tasks and bug fixes. His extensive background in cybersecurity seemed forgotten, despite the company's growing needs in that area. When a major security upgrade project came up, exactly the kind of work he specialized in, it went to a developer with half his experience. "We need someone who really understands our system inside and out," his boss had explained, though he had consistently demonstrated his deep understanding of their architecture. The explanation rang hollow, especially since the chosen developer had joined the company 2 months after him. The situation wasn't limited to work assignments. During team lunches, his boss would actively engage with others, discussing their weekend plans and sharing jokes. But whenever he joined these conversations, the boss would suddenly become engrossed in his phone or find an excuse to leave the table. The contrast was so obvious that even his colleagues had started to notice, throwing sympathetic glances his way. One particularly frustrating afternoon, he overheard his boss talking to another manager in the break room. They were discussing upcoming promotions, and he clearly heard his boss say, "Some people just aren't ready for more responsibility, no matter what their resume says." The pointed nature of the comment was unmistakable, especially given the conversation he'd had with his boss earlier that day about taking on more challenging projects. He started documenting everything, every dismissed suggestion, every overlooked contribution, every instance of different treatment. His notes filled a digital folder that grew larger each week. But he remained professional, producing excellent work and maintaining his composure even as the frustration built inside him. The situation reached a new level when he discovered that his code reviews were being scrutinized far more heavily than those of his colleagues. Changes that sailed through when submitted by others were nitpicked when they came from him. He had to provide extensive documentation and justification for even minor updates, while others could push through significant changes with minimal explanation. During a major code review session, he watched in disbelief as his boss praised a colleague's implementation of an algorithm that was nearly identical to one he had proposed months ago. The only difference: his version had actually included additional security measures that would have made the system more robust. The break room incident that followed was the final straw. He was getting coffee when he overheard his boss making a thinly veiled racist joke to another manager. The words weren't explicitly offensive, but the implication was clear. His hand tightened around his coffee cup as he listened, maintaining his composure even as anger and disappointment coursed through him. That evening, as he sat at his desk long after most of his colleagues had gone home, he carefully reviewed all the documentation he had gathered. The pattern was clear and undeniable. But something else was becoming clear too. There was more to this situation than simple prejudice. His boss's behavior seemed to carry an undercurrent of something deeper, something almost personal, though they had never met before he joined the company. What he didn't know was that fate was about to play its hand. The upcoming company-wide presentation would be a turning point, though not in the way anyone expected. As he prepared his materials for the presentation, he had no idea that his boss's behavior was about to be explained by a revelation that would shake the foundations of their professional relationship. The tension had been building for 6 months, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. But sometimes, the moments of greatest pressure lead to the most unexpected breakthroughs. As he left the office that evening, the city lights twinkling through the window, he couldn't have known that everything was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The big presentation day had finally arrived. The main conference room at Tech Innovations Incorporated was packed with employees from every department, board members, and even a few important clients. The young developer adjusted his tie one last time before entering, clutching his laptop that contained months of hard work, a revolutionary security protocol that could change how the company protected its data. He'd spent countless late nights perfecting this system, testing it against every possible vulnerability. His hands were slightly shaky, but his voice was steady as he began setting up his presentation. The room buzzed with anticipation. This was the biggest company meeting of the quarter. The CEO opened the session with a brief introduction about the importance of cybersecurity in today's digital landscape. As she spoke, he noticed his boss sitting in the front row, arms crossed, wearing an expression that made his stomach tighten. He'd seen that look before, but surely even his boss wouldn't try to undermine him during such an important presentation. Taking a deep breath, he began his presentation. The first few slides went smoothly as he explained the current security challenges facing the industry. The audience seemed engaged, with several people nodding along as he described common vulnerabilities in existing systems. Then came the moment to present his innovative solution. Just as he was explaining the core feature of his security protocol, a voice cut through the room like a knife. "Excuse me," his boss interrupted, not bothering to raise his hand. "But isn't this approach rather basic?" The word basic dripped with condescension. Maintaining his composure, he started to explain the sophisticated nature of the protocol's underlying architecture. But before he could finish his sentence, his boss interrupted again. "I'm concerned about the reliability of these methods," his boss announced to the room. Perhaps someone with more experience should have handled this project. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Several colleagues shifted in their seats, looking down at their notebooks or suddenly becoming very interested in their water bottles. The CEO's expression was unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. Despite the interruption, he tried to continue, moving to the next slide showing the successful test results. His boss's voice cut in again. "Those test parameters seem inadequate. Did you even consider multiple vector attacks?" The question was clearly designed to make him look unprepared, even though his documentation included extensive testing against various attack scenarios. With each interruption, his boss became more bold, questioning not just the technical aspects, but subtly highlighting his supposed lack of qualifications. "Maybe this level of security architecture is beyond your current capabilities," his boss suggested, the implied meaning clear to everyone in the room. The young developer's hands were trembling slightly now, but he kept his voice steady. He pulled up the test results, showing how his system had successfully repelled even the most sophisticated attack simulations. But his boss wasn't done. "I'm not sure everyone here is convinced about the validity of these results," his boss announced, looking around the room as if speaking for everyone present. "Perhaps we should consider bringing in an external consultant to review this work." The humiliation was palpable. Here he was, presenting months of innovative work, being publicly torn down in front of the entire company. Some of his colleagues looked embarrassed, others uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The silence in the room was deafening. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead as he tried to maintain his professional demeanor. Every point he made was met with a dismissive comment or a skeptical question. His boss wasn't just questioning his work anymore, he was questioning his competence, his experience, and his place at the company. What made it worse was that he knew his security protocol was solid. He'd spent months researching, testing, and refining it. The documentation was thorough, the test results were impressive, and the innovation was real. But none of that seemed to matter as his boss continued to undermine him. Just as the situation seemed unbearable, something unexpected happened. The CEO's assistant quietly entered the room and handed her a note. She read it quickly, her expression changing subtly. Without explanation, she stood up and called for a 15-minute break. As people filed out of the room, many avoided making eye contact with him. A few colleagues patted his shoulder sympathetically as they passed. He stood there, beside his interrupted presentation, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Little did he know that this moment of public humiliation would lead to a revelation that would change everything. As he gathered his materials, trying to decide whether to even continue the presentation after the break, the CEO's assistant approached him. "The CEO would like to see you in her office immediately," the assistant said quietly. Walking toward the CEO's office, he couldn't have known that he was about to learn something that would completely transform his understanding of his boss's behavior. Sometimes the darkest moments come just before the most unexpected light, and this moment of professional humiliation was about to become the catalyst for an extraordinary change. The walk to the CEO's office felt like the longest journey of his life. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as his mind raced through what had just happened in the presentation room. The sound of his boss's dismissive voice still rang in his ears, and his cheeks burned with the lingering embarrassment of being publicly humiliated. The CEO's office was different from what he expected. Instead of the cold, corporate atmosphere he imagined, it felt surprisingly warm. Family photos lined the shelves, and a small collection of engineering awards sat modestly in one corner. The CEO, an Asian-American woman in her early 50s, gestured for him to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs facing her desk. "I apologize for what happened in there," she began, her voice carrying a mix of concern and something else he couldn't quite identify. "But there's something you need to know." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out what looked like an old photograph. "Before I show you this," she continued, "I want you to know that I've been quietly investigating several complaints about your boss's behavior over the past few months. Your situation isn't unique, but it is special." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Has your father ever mentioned anything about his early days in the tech industry?" The question caught him off guard. His father, a brilliant computer science professor who'd retired years ago, rarely spoke about his early career. He shook his head, wondering what this had to do with his current situation. The CEO handed him the photograph, and the world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. The picture, slightly faded but still clear, showed two young men standing side by side at what appeared to be a civil rights rally from the early 2000s. One was unmistakably his father, looking young and determined, holding a sign advocating for equality in the tech industry. But it was the other person in the photo that made his breath catch in his throat. Standing next to his father, arm thrown casually over his shoulder with a bright, genuine smile, was his boss, 20 years younger but undeniably the same person. They looked like close friends, their body language showing none of the tension that now filled their every interaction. "Your father was more than just a colleague to your boss," the CEO explained gently. "He was his mentor, his guide into the tech world. They worked together at one of the biggest tech companies in the country." She pulled out more photographs, spreading them across her desk like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Each image told a story. His father and his boss at industry conferences, working late nights in an old office, celebrating project successes. In every photo, they looked like a dream team, two brilliant minds working to change the tech landscape. "But something happened," the CEO continued, her voice growing softer. "Something that your boss has carried with him for 20 years. When I realized who you were, who your father was, everything started making sense." She reached for a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline spoke of a major tech project failure, but it was the smaller details that caught his eye. His father's name was mentioned, along with his boss's, but something about the story felt incomplete. "Your boss's behavior isn't about you," she explained. "It's about guilt. Deep, long-lasting guilt that he's never properly dealt with." She paused, making sure he was following. "When your father needed support during a crucial moment in his career, your boss chose to protect himself instead. That decision led to your father's early retirement from the industry he loved." The revelation hit him like a wave. All those months of unfair treatment, the constant undermining, the public humiliation, none of it was really about him. He was a living reminder of a past his boss had tried to forget, carrying his father's features, his mannerisms, even following a similar career path. "Look at him in that first photo," the CEO said softly. "That young man believed in equality, in making the tech world better for everyone. He was your father's proudest mentee. But one moment of weakness, one decision made out of fear, changed everything." She pulled out one final document, a series of emails from 20 years ago. "Your boss has been trying to contact your father for years, seeking forgiveness. But your father moved away after retiring, changed his contact information. The guilt has eaten at your boss ever since." The office fell silent as he processed this information. The man who had made his life difficult for months wasn't just a prejudiced boss. He was someone carrying 2 decades of remorse, seeing a ghost of his past mistakes every time he looked at his new employee's face. "I'm showing you this because tomorrow, I'm calling a meeting with both of you," The CEO explained. "It's time for this cycle to end. But I wanted you to understand the full picture first. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are carrying their own deep wounds." As he left the CEO's office, clutching copies of the photographs she'd given him, his mind was spinning. The hallway that had felt so oppressive just an hour ago now seemed different. Everything was different. He had walked into that office looking for justice, but he had found something far more complex, a story of friendship, betrayal, regret, and the long shadow that our past actions can cast over our present. What would happen in tomorrow's meeting would change not just his relationship with his boss, but the entire culture of the company. Sometimes understanding where pain comes from is the first step toward healing it. The next morning arrived with a weight of anticipation that made the air feel heavy. The CEO's private conference room, smaller and more intimate than the main presentation space, felt like a completely different world. The young developer arrived first, the old photographs still fresh in his mind from yesterday's revelation. His boss walked in a few minutes later, looking unusually subdued. The confident, intimidating presence that had dominated yesterday's presentation was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable. The CEO stepped between them, a gentle but firm presence as she began to speak. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," she said, placing the old photograph on the table between them. The boss's reaction was immediate. His face paled, and his hands, usually so steady, began to tremble slightly. Where did you get that?" he whispered, reaching for the photograph with shaking fingers. His eyes fixed on the younger version of himself, standing proudly next to his former mentor. "I've been friends with the professor's wife for years," the CEO explained quietly. "When I realized the connection, everything fell into place." She turned to the young developer. "Your father changed many lives in the tech industry, including your boss's." The boss's composure cracked. 20 years of buried guilt seemed to surface all at once. "I knew who you were the moment you walked in for your interview," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like him. The same determination in your eyes, the same way of explaining complex ideas, even the same hand gestures when you're excited about a project." He pulled out his wallet and removed a worn business card, his former mentor's card from 20 years ago. "I've carried this every day since that project went wrong," he said. "A reminder of the biggest mistake of my life." The story came pouring out. 20 years ago, there had been a major security breach at their company. The professor, the young developer's father, had discovered serious flaws in their system months earlier and had proposed fixes, but his warnings had been ignored by upper management. "Your father stood up to them," the boss continued, his voice catching. "He was ready to go public with his concerns, to force the company to address the vulnerabilities. He asked for my support. I was his protege, his success story. He believed in me when nobody else did, gave me my first real chance in tech." The young developer listened intently as the boss described how fear had overwhelmed him. Instead of standing with his mentor, he had sided with management. He had even suggested that his mentor was being alarmist, undermining the very person who had helped build his career. "When the breach happened, it was exactly as your father had predicted. The company tried to blame him, saying he should have been more insistent about the risks." The boss's voice cracked. "I stayed silent. I watched them push him out, destroying his reputation in the industry. I did nothing." Tears were flowing freely now, years of suppressed guilt finally finding release. "Every time I look at you, I see him. I see my cowardice. I see the man I failed. And instead of facing that guilt, I took it out on you. I became everything I once fought against alongside your father." The young developer sat in stunned silence, processing this flood of information. The months of unfair treatment, the constant undermining, the public humiliation, it all stemmed from this unresolved guilt, this festering wound from the past. "I tried to find him after I finally gathered the courage to apologize," the boss continued. "But he had moved away, changed his number. Nobody would tell me how to reach him." He pulled out his phone, showing dozens of drafted emails that had never been sent. The CEO watched this exchange quietly, letting the truth have its moment. Then she spoke. "The question now is, what do we do with this truth? How do we move forward?" The young developer looked at the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. The man who had made his work life so difficult was the same person who had once stood proudly beside his father, fighting for equality in the tech industry. "My father," he began slowly, "he never told me about any of this. But he did teach me something important. He always said that the true measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, but in how they choose to correct them." The boss looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that seeing you succeed here, watching you develop the same brilliant solutions your father once did, it's been like watching his legacy continue. And I've been sabotaging that legacy out of my own shame." The CEO leaned forward. "We have an opportunity here," she said, "to not just heal old wounds, but to create something positive from this pain, something that would make your father proud." As they sat in that conference room, surrounded by the weight of the past and the possibility of the future, something began to shift. The truth, finally spoken aloud after 20 years, had opened a door. What would walk through that door would depend on what they chose to do next. The days following that emotional meeting brought changes that nobody at Tech Innovations Incorporated could have predicted. The transformation began quietly at first, like a gentle ripple in a pond that gradually grows into a wave of positive change. The boss's first step was to call an immediate team meeting. Standing before his department, he did something unprecedented. He apologized, not just to the young developer, but to everyone who had witnessed his behavior over the past months. His voice shook slightly as he spoke about personal growth, about facing our mistakes, and about the responsibility leaders have to lift others up rather than tear them down. "I lost my way," he admitted to the stunned room. "I forgot what it means to be a true mentor, to support and guide rather than to judge and restrict. Today, that changes." The young developer watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but there was something undeniably genuine in his boss's changed behavior. It showed in small ways at first. The boss began actively seeking his input during meetings, highlighting his contributions rather than dismissing them. Then came the bigger changes. The boss approached him with an idea that would reshape the company's future. "Your father believed in opening doors for others," he said one afternoon. "He believed that talent could come from anywhere, if only given the chance. I think it's time we honored that belief." Together, they began developing a comprehensive mentorship program for the company. It wasn't just about technical skills, it was about creating real opportunities for underrepresented groups in tech. The boss shared stories about how the young developer's father had guided him, teaching him not just coding, but also the importance of integrity and standing up for what's right. The program they created was unlike anything the industry had seen before. It paired experienced developers with newcomers from diverse backgrounds, providing not just technical training, but also career guidance and support. The boss insisted on building in safeguards to prevent the kind of systemic biases he had once perpetuated. "Your security protocol presentation," he said one day, "the one I tried to tear down. We're going to make it the cornerstone of our new training program. But this time you'll present it your way with my full support." The young developer found himself working side by side with the man who had once tried to diminish him. As they collaborated, he saw glimpses of the person from those old photographs, the passionate advocate who had stood beside his father, fighting for equality in tech. The CEO watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, occasionally stepping in to provide resources and support for their initiatives. Under her guidance, the company began actively recruiting from historically underrepresented communities, creating partnerships with educational institutions in underserved areas. The changes weren't always smooth. Some old habits died hard, and there were moments of tension as they navigated their new dynamic. But each challenge was met with open communication and a shared commitment to doing better. 3 months after that revealing meeting, the young developer received an unexpected email. His father had finally been located, living quietly in a small coastal town. The boss asked if he would help arrange a meeting, a chance to make amends after 20 years. That meeting became another turning point. The 3 men sat together in a small cafe, the weight of 2 decades of unspoken words finally lifting. The young developer watched as his father and his former protege reconnected, their conversation moving from painful past mistakes to hopes for the future. As the mentorship program grew, its success began attracting attention from other companies. Industry publications wrote about the innovative approach to diversity and inclusion, but more importantly, lives were being changed. Young developers from all backgrounds were finding opportunities they might never have had otherwise. 1 year after the confrontation in the conference room, Tech Innovations Incorporated hosted a special event celebrating the program's success. The boss stood at the podium, but instead of speaking himself, he invited the young developer to share their story. Looking out at the audience, the young developer saw faces filled with hope, program participants, mentors, and industry leaders who had come to learn from their example. He shared not just the success stories, but also the difficult journey that had led to this moment. Sometimes, he concluded, the greatest changes come from facing our past mistakes honestly. True leadership isn't about never failing, it's about how we choose to right our wrongs and lift others up along the way. The boss stood beside him as he finished speaking, no longer the intimidating figure from a year ago, but a partner in creating positive change. Together, they had transformed a story of prejudice and guilt into one of redemption and hope. The program they created continues to grow, spreading to other companies and industries. But perhaps its greatest success isn't in the numbers or accolades, it's in the simple truth that healing is possible, that people can change, and that sometimes our deepest wounds can lead to our greatest contributions. As the young developer drives home that evening, he thinks about how far they've come. The photograph of his father and his boss still sits on his desk, but now it's not just a reminder of past pain. It's a symbol of how confronting our mistakes can lead to meaningful change. Sometimes, he realizes, the hardest roads lead to the most important destinations.